The gardens vanished first, not because the soil failed, because the soldiers came. Fields were trampled, yields confiscated. Open planting meant exposure, and exposure meant hunger. So families went underground, literally. Behind barns, beneath rotting floorboards, and inside rusted ruins, they planted food where no one dared to look. This wasn't farming. It was resistance. Every seed was buried like a secret, every leaf a risk. Crops were grown not in rows, but in shadows, inside broken stoves, under hay bales, along fence lines that looked abandoned but weren't. Modern survival talks about gardening as a hobby. In 1943, it was rebellion. They didn't grow food for health. They grew it to endure, because when war arrived, the ground still gave, but only to those who knew how to hide what grew. These are 7 forgotten two food sources planted in silence and harvested in defiance. Number 1. Rooftop root garden. In the occupied cities of Eastern Europe, soil wasn't just scarce, it was watched. Open fields were seized, backyard gardens were raided. Every visible crop risked being taken before it could feed a single mouth. But rooftops, those broken, sagging structures above bombed apartments, were overlooked. That's where families planted food meant to be seen by no one. Bricks were lifted to make space. Rusting tins, shattered crates, and salvaged rubble were filled with any dirt that could be scraped from basements or alleyways. There was no fertilizer, no watering schedule, just desperation and instinct. They chose what could grow without fanfare. Root vegetables, carrots, turnips, and beets, crops that grew beneath the surface, out of sight and left nothing for patrolling eyes to notice. To prevent detection from above, they kept the containers low. Flat, wide pans pressed to the roof's edge. The soil was packed tight. Plants were thinned early, never allowed to grow too tall or cast long shadows. Water came from rain, collected in broken jars or led through cloth funnels fashioned from torn coats. Some families reused bathwater, cooled ash water, or even snow, melted slowly and rationed like oil. It wasn't efficient. Many rooftops collapsed under weight. Others leaked into the rooms below. Pests arrived. Wind tore young leaves. But still, the method spread, because it was invisible from the ground, and that alone made it worth trying. In Warsaw, entire tenement blocks coordinated planting schedules to rotate soil use. In Rotterdam, survivors planted in chimney soot, filtering it first through rags. In Budapest, vegetables were disguised as rooftop debris hidden beneath tarps or netting. Nothing about it was convenient. The harvest was small, a handful of roots, a few edible greens. But in a world where ration lines stretched for hours and calories disappeared in minutes, even a single carrot grown in silence was a victory. These gardens didn't feed feasts. They bought time. Time to wait for the next air raid to pass. Time to keep a child from collapsing. Time to stretch one more day without aid. They weren't beautiful, they were broken, sun-baked, and built on the bones of ruined buildings. But they worked. And for those who stood barefoot on those rooftops, pressing seeds into shallow earth with trembling hands, it wasn't gardening, it was survival, scattered across rooftops the world had already given up on. Would you trust your life to 3 inches of dirt and hope? Stay with us. What they grew next was hidden inside straw. Number 2. Hay bale seed beds. In farmlands stripped of freedom, even empty space drew suspicion. Soldiers knew where to look. Under beds, behind sheds, inside barrels. But hay was ignored. It was too ordinary, too low in value. That's exactly why it became one of the war's most brilliant covers. Families began using hay bales as hidden seed beds, not beside the field, instead of the field. They stacked the bales against barn walls, in alleyways, or around livestock pens, then grew food directly inside them. Straw is hollow. It holds warmth, moisture, and space, like soil, but lighter. So with a sharp stick or dull knife, civilians hollowed out pockets in the center of the bales. These cavities were packed with compost, ash, or whatever earth they could salvage. Then came the seed seeds, peas, spinach, turnips, anything compact, fast-growing, and able to survive in shallow root space. The method had a second benefit: insulation. Hay bales absorbed warmth during the day and held it overnight. In climates where frost came early or lingered late, this mattered. It extended the growing window without needing greenhouses or glass. Luxuries no longer possible. Watering was minimal. The straw retained moisture. Families poured cooled cooking water or morning dew into the seed pocket. Rain was guided with tin scraps bent into makeshift gutters. From a distance, nothing looked suspicious, just a stack of hay, rough, dry, and common. But buried inside was nutrition, hidden growth, a lifeline behind a disguise. Children helped. They were light enough to reach without damaging structure. They learned to trim leaves close and fast, to harvest early, often, and in silence. In some regions, families rotated the bales. When one was exhausted, it was fed to livestock, or broken down to enrich soil for later planting. Nothing was wasted. Every fiber, every root strand served double duty. Yes, the yields were modest. The method required patience, precise timing, and careful concealment. Too much rain and the bale rotted. Too little, and the crop withered before anyone tasted it. But the advantage was simple. You could walk right past it and never know it held food. In Belgium, whole courtyards were ringed with these disguised gardens. In France, hay was piled inside bomb craters, hiding green life where everything else had died. It wasn't farming. It was camouflage. And for families caught between retreat and starvation, that made all the difference. Could you plant food in plain sight and keep it invisible? What they grew next lived inside hollow logs. Number 3, hollow log mushroom cultures. When the forest stopped providing firewood, people looked at trees differently. Not for warmth, but for growth. Not what stood tall, but what had already fallen. Hollow logs became food sources, not for planting, but for cultivating mushrooms. In villages where farmland was seized or scorched, these dark, rotting cores offered something precious. Calories grown in complete secrecy. The process didn't require sunlight, didn't need soil, just moisture, shade, and patience. Families searched for the right kind of log, damp, decaying hardwoods like beech, oak, or elm. If they found one already hollowed by insects or time, it saved work. If not, they carved it by hand, scraping the center with metal shards or burnt tools. Inside the cavity, they packed forest debris, wet leaves, crushed bark, wood ash. Then came the key: spores. Some spores were passed down in jars, inherited like heirlooms. Others were collected from wild mushrooms, scraped from stems, dried, and stored for use. These spores were dusted inside the logs or mixed into the damp filler. Once sealed, the log was left in the shadows, behind sheds, under carts, buried beneath branches, hidden anywhere light didn't reach. Time did the rest. Weeks passed. Moisture condensed inside the log's walls. Mycelium threads spread like silent veins, and slowly, quietly, mushroom, not flashy, no bright colors or broad caps, simple, edible fungi, oyster, shaggy mane, puffball, whatever grew native and safe. They were harvested with bare hands, twisted gently, cleaned with cloth, never water, laid out to dry or cooked that same night in pots set deep in coals. Mushrooms didn't need fuel to grow. They didn't attract suspicion. They didn't leave footprints. In some cases, logs produced for years, so long as they were rotated, rested, and kept moist. Old logs were fed to goats or broken into mulch. New logs took their place. The method spread quietly across resistance. In occupied Norway, it was used behind alpine huts. In Czech villages, logs were hidden behind fences disguised as fallen wood. In Italy, they were placed inside abandoned chimneys, smoke no longer rising, but sustenance still growing. It wasn't risk-free. Some mushrooms spoiled, some logs collapsed, some children got sick from mistaking the wrong species. But for those who learned and remembered, the rewards were consistent. You didn't need land, you didn't need tools, just decay, discipline, and the belief that life could still emerge from rot. In a world where nothing seemed to grow anymore, these logs became proof that nature hadn't given up, and neither had the families who guarded them. Could you trust your life to something growing in darkness? Because the next food source was hidden inside firewood itself. Number 4, false wood piles. In every village, firewood was common, piled behind homes, stacked beside barns, dumped near broken fences. No one questioned a heap of logs because everyone needed heat. That's exactly why it became one of the war's most ingenious hiding places. Families built false wood piles, not to burn, to grow. They started with a frame, often scrap wood nailed into a hollow box, the size of a small crate or barrel. This frame was placed where it looked natural, next to chimneys, behind stables, or in the corners of bombed courtyards. Inside the box, they added soil, not deep, just enough for shallow roots. Then came the seeds, radishes, spinach, dwarf beans, anything that could sprout fast and stay low. Around the box, they stacked logs, old ones, cracked ones, bark half-rotted. The key wasn't perfection, it was randomness. Logs leaned loosely, some cross-hatched, others thrown flat. They needed to look like a mess no one wanted to clean. Watering had to be precise. Too much, and the disguise collapsed. Too little, and the crop dried before it broke the soil. Families used cloth-wrapped funnels hidden between gaps, dripping water slowly into the growing bed below. Children were often tasked with tending these piles. They had smaller hands, lighter steps, and they knew how to move without sound. When harvest came, it wasn't a feast. It was a handful of green, enough for soup, enough for a spread of bread, enough to remind a family that growth was still possible, even under wood. Some households built multiple piles, each one staggered, rotating crops, using crushed leaves as compost between seasons. Others created decoys, real wood piles next to fake ones, adding layers of confusion for any patrolling eyes. In Slovakia, these false piles lined the backs of churches. In Lithuania, they appeared in courtyards once used for weddings, now silent, now feeding families from within. Even in cities like Prague, wood piles leaned against apartment rubble, blending in with collapsed stairwells and burned-out doors. It wasn't gardening, it was strategy. Because these weren't spaces meant for food, they were ruins, they were camouflage. And that's why they worked. The limits were clear. False wood piles couldn't feed many, they couldn't grow tall crops, they couldn't withstand a soldier with a bayonet and time. But for families living day to day, they provided something industrial food couldn't: control. Control over what to plant. Control over where to hide it. Control over one small corner of life in a world unraveling. One pile, one layer, one risk. That's how people ate. Would you build a garden inside firewood just to keep your family fed? Because the next food source was hidden inside bombed stoves no one thought could grow life again. Number 5. Broken stove. Planters in cities reduced to rubble, the kitchens went cold, gas lines severed, electric coils silent. What once cooked meals now collected dust, ash, and memory. But not all of it was useless. Families turned to the last thing anyone thought could grow food: the stove itself. Abandoned cook stoves, cast iron, brick, or ceramic, stood in hollowed buildings like skeletons of domestic life. But their structure offered something rare: containment, and that made them useful again. The idea was simple. Remove the burners, break open the base, fill every compartment with earth, compost, and crushed ash from collapsed chimneys. Then plant. Tomatoes, onions, chard, fast-growing, shallow-rooted crops that could survive in tight, dry spaces. The stove acted like a raised bed, disguised as debris. Soldiers didn't check inside. They stepped over it, walked past it. No one expected food to be growing where meals had once died. Families painted rust onto the outer shell, covered the soil with soot, even placed broken pots around it for added disguise. The more forgotten it looked, the safer it became. In some towns, entire alleyways were lined with repurposed stoves, each one filled with different crops, each family claiming a burner like a plot of land. Rain was collected from broken gutters, rag-wrapped tin cups funneled water through side vents. No watering cans, no tools, just soaked cloth and memory guiding where moisture should fall. The benefits were quiet but powerful. The iron absorbed heat by day and released it slowly through the night. Even in cold seasons, the soil stayed warmer than the air. Frost delayed, growth extended. There were risks. Sharp edges cut fingers. Collapsed floors made heavy stoves dangerous to move. And in some cases, flames from nearby buildings reheated the soil, destroying weeks of fragile growth. But the method endured because it used what war left behind. Not new materials, not fancy tools, just wreckage and the will to plant inside it. In Marseille, families used their broken stoves as herb beds. In Berlin, they filled oven chambers with carrots, sliced open baking compartments to let light in. In Sarajevo, stoves were buried halfway into the ground, turned into coolers by day, warmers by night. This wasn't farming. It wasn't a garden. It was resurrection. Out of bombed kitchens, life returned, leaf by leaf. Children learned to harvest from stove tops that had never seen flame. Grandmothers cleaned soot from basil, whispering names of dishes they hadn't made in years. These planters didn't feed feasts, but they fed hope. Hope that something ruined could still give. That even the shell of nourishment could nourish again. Could you grow food in the heart of something designed to cook it? Because the next harvest wasn't planted in metal or soil, but climbed quietly along a fence line no one watched. Number 6. Fence line vine crops. Not every crop needed depth. Some needed reach. In the chaos of wartime Europe, vertical space became the last forgotten asset. Walls were watched, roofs were dangerous, but fence lines, bent, rusted, leaning, were everywhere, and no one saw them as food. That's exactly why civilians began using fence lines to grow vine crops, silently, stealthily, successfully. Every fence had gaps between slats, under rails. There, families planted seeds, cucumber, squash, pole beans, anything with tendrils, anything that knew how to climb. The soil was shallow, but the sunlight was honest. Morning rays hit the base. By midday, the vines reached higher than the eyes that overlooked them. They didn't build new fences. That would raise questions. They used what was already rotting: livestock pens, abandoned garden edges, the rusting skeletons of old property lines, and they trained the vines to rise, without tools, without twine, without witness. Some guided growth with torn cloth strips. Others buried sticks at an angle, coaxing the plant's path between wooden ribs. It took no strength, just memory, the kind passed down by hands that once grew food in peace, now forced to grow it in silence. Rainwater was captured from fence posts. Funnels made of hollow reeds guided it to the roots. Dew was absorbed with old towels, wrung out into cracked bowls, and poured back at dawn. Harvest was done early, before patrols, before questions. Fruits were picked small, hidden in coats, or passed under fence panels to waiting hands. In Denmark, children were trained to watch for soldier shadows before gathering food. In Austria, beans were picked at night, by touch, not sight. In Ukraine, squash was harvested green, weeks before full ripeness, because unripe meant unnoticed. It wasn't efficient. The soil near fences was often poor, rocky, or laced with runoff. Yields were inconsistent. Crops sometimes curled from cold or browned from heat. But they grew, and they grew where nothing else dared, because fences were overlooked. They were boundary markers, not battlefields. That made them the perfect place to plant quietly and survive loudly. In some regions, entire garden networks grew only along fences. 10 meters here, 3 meters there, not visible from above, not traceable from the road. But when connected, they formed a hidden system of nourishment that fed dozens, not with abundance, but with consistency. The vines clung to what war left behind: iron, wood, rust, and silence. They used the wreckage of old lives as scaffolding for new ones, and they held on, season after season, like the hands that planted them. These weren't just vegetables, they were messages, proof that you didn't need land, only patience, that food could rise where no one expected it to, and that when everything fell, something could still climb. Could you plant food along your fences and risk being seen for? Because the final method didn't grow from soil or ash. It was planted beneath feet, inside a place no soldier ever suspected. Number 7. Hidden latrine gardens. In the most devastated corners of war-torn Europe, even soil became a luxury. Farms were burned, gardens seized, and in many occupied zones, to be seen planting food was to invite suspicion or punishment. But there was one place no one looked, one place too unpleasant for patrols, too avoided for inspection: latrines. What began as necessity turned into strategy. Civilians, especially those in remote farms and forested villages, began using dry latrine sites as secret gardens, not for large harvests, but for survival plants, roots that required warmth, waste, and above all, privacy. It didn't happen immediately. It took memory. Before the war, rural families used composting toilets. They knew what night soil could do, how to age it, how to bury it, how to make it feed rather than poison. They built raised beds around latrine pits, not directly on top, always downwind, always shaded. They used old boards, crates, or bricks to shape beds around the structure. And in those beds, they planted high-demand, nutrient-hungry crops: cabbage, leeks, pumpkin, and medicinal roots like burdock and comfrey. The latrine's waste, once broken down by time, heat, and dry ash, became slow-release fertilizer. Not immediate, never fresh. It had to rot first, months or even a year before planting began. In Poland, families added layers of charcoal and sand to speed decomposition. In Romania, ashes from stoves were mixed with dry soil to balance acidity. In the Balkans, clay jugs filled with vinegar were buried nearby to absorb odor, keeping insects and soldiers away alike. Children weren't allowed near. Only elders tended these gardens, not out of fear, but respect. They knew the line between nourishment and contamination. They knew the waiting time. They knew when the soil was safe. And these gardens didn't look like gardens. They looked like abandonment. Rotten wood, a crumbling outhouse, weeds deliberately left to grow around the border. It was camouflage, crafted from disgust. But what they pulled from that soil didn't disgust them. It fed them. In some regions, these gardens became permanent rotations. 1 year of waste, 1 year of silence, 1 year of growth. It was slow. It was dangerous if rushed. But it worked. And it worked because no one suspected the land beneath a latrine could be fertile. These families weren't careless. They filtered water, boiled everything, washed with vinegar. But they ate from those plots, season after season, when nothing else was left. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. And in every cabbage leaf, in every steaming root pulled from that reclaimed earth, there was a lesson. Life grows where death was dumped. The limits were obvious. You couldn't grow for trade. You couldn't plant every year. You couldn't risk visibility, but it gave enough. Enough to stretch a stew, enough to feed a child, enough to live through another frost. Would you eat from a garden grown beside waste if it meant one more winter of survival? Because for these civilians, it wasn't a question. It was routine, buried deep, remembered quietly. In the end, food didn't grow where it was welcome. It grew where it was possible. They didn't grow food to thrive. They grew food to endure. These weren't farms. These were fractures, quietly stitched with roots, leaves, and the last seeds they could find. Nothing about it was elegant. Nothing was ideal. But in the silence of occupation, in the shadows of broken homes, families turned to the soil where no one else would. Under hay, inside ash, beside waste, between fences that had lost their purpose. They didn't wait for rescue. They didn't pray for trucks or aid. They looked at wreckage and planted inside it. Because when systems fall, it's not the loudest who survive. It's the most disciplined, the ones who prepare in silence, the ones who know that land doesn't need permission to grow. Only attention. No fertilizer, no fallback, just rhythm, memory, and the will to keep a family fed, even if it meant planting next to a latrine or inside the mouth of a dead stove. That's the wisdom we've lost. That's the grit we've forgotten. And that's what this channel exists to revive before the lights go out again. Hit subscribe, because in every war, every famine, and every collapse, it was never gear that kept people alive. It was knowledge buried deep, waiting to be remembered. One subscription isn't for the channel. It's for the past they died to preserve, and the future you may have to survive.